The stars keep a ledger, and they remember. I was already sweating before we broke the dust halo, and not because the ship ran warm. The brown dwarf bled a dim rust through the viewport, a coal without flame tucked inside black glass. The ring around it, half a ring, really hung in ribs and shadow like an unfinished cathedral. You didn't need charts to know the place had been fought over. You could smell the scorched alloy and recycled air and see the pitted hulls drifting slow as funeral candles. Somewhere in that skeletal arc waited the thing we had come for, the thing people here whispered about like a debt that finally came due. Dropping to 6 meters per second, relative Jace said from the helm, fingers poised easy, as if he were drifting a skiff down a lazy river back home. His voice made calm out of uncertainty, as good helmsmen do. The tactile panel snapped as thrusters kissed our mass sideways, nudging us into the shadow of a collapsed maintenance girder. A field of glittering paint flecks rotated past, catching the dwarf's thin light and throwing it back in copper pricks. "Lidar confirms the keel signature," Kaito murmured half to himself. His hair was tied back to keep it away from his scope, a habit he'd learned the hard way in a training centrifuge. "Pattern matches the pre-Babel Saint ship template we mapped from the tetrads. It's here. It's really here." "Run the phrase again," Celine said, not looking up from her notebook. She kept it analog when it mattered, pencil tracks on paper, because tangibility anchors memory. She wore that long gray coat despite the cabin's heat, a scholar's armor against the temptation to skip steps. Kaito cleared his throat and recited in the precise cadence of liturgy learned from a leaked university feed. "Who counts harms that others refuse to count? Who weighs debts that cannot be bought? Who sets the mirror so that force finds itself? The worthy are those who count, weigh, and set." "You're sure that's not propaganda?" Jace asked, flashing me a glance. He always did that, make the skeptical joke and give me the out if I wanted it. "Propaganda tends to be louder," I said. "This is quiet and stubborn." The bridge hummed with the mild, constant buzz of the environmental pumps, a mosquito drone you forgot, until you listened for it. Outside, the ring's ragged teeth slid by. "My name's Mara Vin, Compact Marshal by assignment, and a daughter of a place with too many tides and not enough maps. I had come to this mutilated orbit with a warrant to secure a relic and a promise to do it by law. Both were heavier than they looked. Both had people waiting to take them from my hands if I faltered." "The sigil's faint," Kaito said, magnifying. "But there's a glow in the hull ribs, like banked coals." "Foreshadowed in the petition records," Celine said, pencil moving. The Saint ships slept with their arrays warm like kettles always ready to pour. They never truly went cold. "We're not touching the body until we know where the hands are," I said. I pivoted my chair and raised the external channels, broadcast open on civilian band. "Put me across the belt." Static turned to murmur and murmur into voices. Doc 2 at Kiln Station wanted clarity on the salvage zone radius. A miner on Cell 17 reported outsiders in clean hulls sniffing around claim markers. A mother on the free barge Linnet asked if our operation would interrupt solar panels during the dusk shift because she had bread in the oven and 3 children who could smell flour. I answered in order with the small kindnesses that oil large gears the zone would be marked, and respected claims logged the power draw scheduled after dusk. "Before the big moves, you show the small ones." Marshall came a new voice, clipped and crisp as a stapled document. "This is Magistrate Helion Odris of the local court. We understand the compact has authorized you to inspect the object designated in Petition 41F. We ask for reassurance that your actions will not offend the Treaty of Broken Things." "The treaty forbids wrecking in ways that make more wreck," I replied. "It doesn't forbid understanding what the wreck was. The compact will act in the open and be answerable in your docket." "In the open," he said as if tasting something too honest. "We will hold you to that." We cut the channel. Jace leaned back and whistled. Local robes nervous. Because nervous is smart, I said. The looters, the callers, and the fearful all packed a lunch. We'll see some of them before lunch, Kaito said, flicking a feed across our glass. 3 ships unlicensed came into focus against the dwarf's dim pearl. They kept a loose triangle, the kind scavengers adopt when they want to look like a fleet. Tallyrite colors, he added, as if anyone who'd worked the frontier needed the label. I felt the familiar tightening behind my breastbone, a hand gathering cloth. We had an old gun hung under our keel, and friends on a good day, but not enough friends for foolishness. The relic would draw all kinds of hunger. Some of them sharpened their hunger with law, some with knives, and some with prayers. Put this across public, I said. Not a threat, a notice. My words went out under our badge stamped with date and vector. We announced a perimeter for safety and a registry for claims and a schedule for power draws to keep the ovens on. We announced a hearing for any contesting hands at Kiln's West Shed with seats for the bold and the reluctant. And then we added the part that mattered most. Record shows, I said, that the thing under this ring was called a saint ship by people who came before us. It was not named so for its temper, but for its count. If it wakes, it will be asked to count us. If it does, we want it to find. We learned to count ourselves. We chose to teach before we dared to touch. The dockworkers heard it first. In the shadow of Rib 18, a team from the station's Longshore Union had rigged a rope line to steady their pallet shuttle, and they swore later that the rope itself hummed like a plucked string. Dust rose from the hull plates in glittering threads. A sigil no larger than my palm pulsed a dull ember on a beam that didn't require beams. The kids from the free barge Linnet leaned against the viewport glass noses, making moons as their mother shushed them and forgot the bread. We eased closer. Kaito painted the object's outline in green. The anchor mass was the size of an old frigate, its skin like cooled obsidian. There were no windows, only seams where seams shouldn't exist. The half-ring hugged it like a broken arm that still remembered the weight of a friend. Celine walked me through step 1, I said. We cannot break what we claim to understand, she replied. So we present a problem that tests temper, not force. If it is what the texts suggest, it will accept a lesson before accepting a leash. Lessons first, Jace said, grinning. I slept through force, so that's good timing. We rigged the teaching rig from the oldest parts we trusted. Neither quantum nor trickery, just lights, rhythms, and sums. The Saint ship's earliest stories spoke of ships that preferred numbers to oaths, as if numbers were the first language that all thinking things had to share. We arranged a lattice of buoy lights across the half-ring and pulsed them in prime intervals 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and beyond. We mirrored the intervals into longer gaps, then let them settle. The brown dwarf's faint wind braided through the debris and tugged dust tails from bolts. I stood by the forward blister during the cycle, listening to the ship's breath and my own. The hum in the rope line was gone. The sigil pulsed slower, then faster, then matched our primes until the ring of buoys looked like a crown made of a math teacher's heartbeat. Okay, Celine whispered, which meant far more than okay. Phase 2. So we toggled from counting to weighing. The buoys began to mark lengths across the ring in exact ratios, 3 to 4, to 5, then 5 to 12 to 13, and then a pattern that would tell any eye which triangles were fair and which were cheated. The crown reshaped by rule, not by request. Jace made a soft sound. Kaito's hands hovered over his scope like a conductor's baton. I felt a prickle across my scalp, the hairs at the nape standing up as if they were listening harder than I was. Something under the obsidian skin sighed. A panel no one could see without wanting to see it opened like dark lips parting. Inside, where you might expect teeth, was instead a mosaic of brass plates engraved with columns. The columns were not letters. They were tick marks, and the tick marks grew thicker in places where the brass had been often touched. Captain Cato breathed. It's a ledger. You expected wings, Celine murmured. They kept ledgers. Of massive harm, of effort, of time. Saints count because counting is an ethic. Tone is changing, Jace said. Heat trace up by 2 Kelvin. That's a kettle talking. The first word we heard was not a word. It was a chime across our instruments, a tone that made me blink and think of the way a bell vibrates your ribs when you stand too close. It came with a burst of numbers simple as rain, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, then a halt and a space as if to invite a reply. Celine nodded and tapped back a series that required no translation. All the ways you can make 4 with natural numbers, then 6, then 9 like a child stacking blocks to show you they know. A voice followed the chime. Not in our tongue, not in any modern grammar, but in an older cadence that our systems could turn into syllables without lying. It sounded like someone reading an account of the day. Who counts here, it asked. This is Marshal Mara Vin, I replied, pulse thudding but voice level. We count, and we wish to be counted. And who weighs it asked. We do. With you if you permit it. And who sets the mirror? We will if you teach us where to place it. We stood before a mirror we had not built. Before any set piece you make room for those who will live with the aftermath. We called the union heads the station medtech, the mothers, the magistrate's clerk, and the least lucky of the belt miners who always said yes to the worst shifts. We met in West Shed under a ceiling sprigged with rhyme where a heat exchanger had misbehaved last winter, and we listened as the ones who were quiet too often spoke. An old man whose hands were scar-mapped described a sister lost to a collapsing rib when Tallywrights cut a segment free without posting warnings. A girl with braids and the steel gaze you see on those who had learned to speak to magistrates recited the treaty in parts. A cook from the Linnet asked about air budgets because the ovens mattered more than the rumors if you were responsible for 500 mouths. I told them the truth. That we were about to wake something older than our oldest treaties, something that remembered by lines and columns, not by faces. That if it was worthy of the name it had been given, it would care about accounting more than authority. That if we were not worthy, it would find us wanting. I watched the way that last sentence landed. They had lived their lives on the receiving end of wanting. A boy raised his hand as if he were in school. If it asks who is worthy, he said, can we show it the ledger of how my mom kept the ovens on when the power donors wanted to turn them off first? You can, I said, and you will. Then we taught the saintship an old game that was not a game. We staged a case. I acted as clerk. Celine argued for the ring's safety. The Tallywrights, who had slunk to the back of the shed and borrowed station jackets with their tattoos hidden under turtlenecks, argued for first-mover rights and the peril of letting the compact steal the bounty of risk. The magistrate's clerk presented the treaty's page where it spoke of broken things and the duty of those who break to mend. The mothers showed the breads they had baked with the power we had promised to leave untouched. The miners laid out their claim logs, notarized with a grease pen and faith. We piped the proceedings to the open panel. The brass columns inside tilted, and the tick marks etched a little darker, as if a stylus had been dragged across them in slow consideration. The chime came again. You weigh, the voice said. You set a mirror. You count harms that those who harm do not. Who taught you to count? Those who kept ovens lit, Celine replied. Those who stitched lungs after a cut. Those who took the last watch without asking. We learned by living with each other and by reading what your kind left behind. Then Teach the Ship said, teach before you take. We passed lessons into a thing that didn't have ears. Teaching a saint ship felt like telling a bedtime story to an engine. We laid out sequences and fairness proofs. We showed how the treaty flowed, how claims and safety braided. Selena narrated with that unhurried patience that makes stubborn dogs sit. Jace sketched vectors showing how one ship's careless burn sends debris into a neighbor's path. Kaido plotted heat budgets in a shared grid. Our draws the ovens, the station pumps, and that unknown pulse slowly climbing inside the obsidian shell. And then, because teaching is more convincing when the students speak, we handed the projector to the ones who would suffer if we failed. The cook explained how dough rose in a cramped galley when the heaters worked and fell when they didn't. A medtech described the oxygen curves of a patient flush-lunged with dust and the penalties for cycling too quickly. A miner said what a rib collapse sounded like from inside a belly of steel, the groan that precedes a scream in metal. The ship listened, or at least its ledgers changed when we spoke. New columns appeared on the brass plates, narrower, like hastily opened accounts for small debts that had gone long unpaid. The chime came again, lower now. If your mirror is set, it said, I will accept the mirror against those who baldly project harm. You will place the mirror. I will count. Jace pointed at the scope. We've got 3 inbound signals closing fast. The Tallywrights didn't like the hearing, Kato confirmed. The triangle again. Their lead's heating up its coil. They're going to put a hole in somebody to test if we're serious. They want to prove that law is a soft thing, Celine said. Then we have to show them that law can be harder than their hull, I said. Kaito feed the ring's old rails into the model. Jace, I need your hands steady as a prayer. We're going to bounce them. We're going to mirror them, I said. With rails and numbers. We set the mirror where force could see its own teeth. The half-ring's rails were intended for maintenance drones long gone to dust. They were superconductive bones when powered, and we had power if we were careful. We pulsed our draw in a cadence the Saint ship would recognize the prime heartbeat again, not because the rails required it, but because the listening required certainty. The rails drank power like thirsty iron and hummed a vibration you felt through your boots. Vectors locked, Jace said. His fingers raised and fell as he bled thrust into asymmetry so we could drift angle and still keep the rails in plane. Their lead coil is at 60%. They'll fire in 20 seconds if they're hot. Broadcast mirror notice, I said. Kaito shot out a legalese ribbon that looked like a warning label and read like a promise. We declared that any energy projected into the safety zone must be accounted for by the projector. We declared that the accounting would be immediate and visible. We declared that the mirror had been set and its angle published. They'll laugh, Jace muttered. Not for long, Celine said. The coil spat. You can tell the difference between practice and malice by the way a shot is shaped. This one had corners in it. The beam crawled across the ring at a speed that made slow look fast. Its leading edge brushed a rib and sprayed metal snow that steamed as it drifted. Then it met the powered rail. There is a sound, even in vacuum, that comes through your bones when field couples to field. The shot didn't reverse. That's a lie. Stories tell. It bent, and then it unfolded along the rails with a strange gentleness like water being guided into a sluice. The prime heartbeat guided the timing, and the timing turned the busy chaos of a burn into a measured reflection. The bent beam found the lead Tallyright's coil because rails and math are very good at introductions. The pirate's hull didn't explode. It shuddered as the coil overloaded and blew its ceramic casing outward like a flower opening too quickly. The ship spun in a loose, embarrassed corkscrew, bleeding hot vapor. The 2 wingmen cut burn, confused into caution. You did that, the ship said with a tone that could have been respect or simple entry in a ledger. You set the mirror. I counted. We did, I said. And now we request your first act under our treaty intervene so that more harm is not projected. Law acknowledged it, replied. Mirror present. Ledger open. The first lawful act landed like a bell on the water. A ring of blue-white motes lit under the Saint ship's skin and drifted outward along invisible lanes. They took positions like lanterns hung on a festival night, equidistant, each one whispering to the others by light and count. The motes linked to the rails with field lines we could only see where they combed dust into delicate combs. The triangle of Tallyrite ships found themselves gently pushed into a corridor, where their burns corrected themselves into safety, whether their pilots wanted that or not. Like putting the mean kids in the nice line, Jace said. Without bruises. Some bruises, Cato corrected, eyes flicking over the telemetry. Their coil casings gone. Their pride, too. Marshal Mara, the magistrate, came back on the line. He sounded shaken, but trying not to show it. We have the event recorded. Your mirror notice is in the docket. Will it accept depositions? It accepts numbers, I said. But it seems willing to translate harm into count. The boy from the ovens brought his mother a loaf still hot from the second shift. She sliced it on a crate's edge and handed hunks to the union heads, who had kept their eyes hard during the hearing. The medtech breathed into her hands to keep them steady and called the station for 2 gurneys to greet the wounded pirates. The old man with the scarred hands cried in a way that made me look away so he could do it without a witness. You can only mirror force if you've counted your own. We had not bled. We had not fired. We had not grown large at the expense of those who could not. But we had set something into motion that would not stop when we left, and the cost of that is always paid by those who stay. Heat margin down by 14%, Kaito reported. The rails took some of the coil's spill. We can't keep the mirror set at this level forever. Then we don't, I said. We teach the ring to keep its own mirror with the Saint ship's help. We make a plan that lives when we don't. Minor hull pitting along our starboard blister, Jace added quickly, as if to make it sound like nothing. When the rail went hot, a bit of dust fused weird and popped. I'll log the patch requests for after we stand down. And my left wrist is complaining, Celine said softly, rubbing it when she thought no one was looking. The vibration does not agree with the old bones. Logged, I replied. Costs declared. Even the small ones deserve the ledger. I took a breath that tasted like copper and old tea. Outside, the motes drifted in their precise dance. The Saint ship's panel remained open brass plates catching the faint rust light and turning it to honey. Who leads the ship? Asked then with an innocence that carried an edge. Who says when to stop? Who carries the ledger when the first ledger is full? I lead, for now, I said. But I answer to the people who will sleep in this gravity. We will form a board from those gathered. We'll publish the ledgers. You will teach us to keep them without a collar. And if a collar is attempted, then we count the hands that reach, I said. And we set a mirror. Teach before you build walls, or your walls become schools for the wrong lessons. We worked until our throats went raw, and we worked after that. Celine drafted the charter for the Board of Broken Orbits in the shed's lamplight, cross-checked by the magistrate's clerk, whose fingers shook less when she had law to hold. The union heads argued for labor seats. The mothers argued for air budgets. The miners argued for the right to tell the truth about collapse without being called lazy. I mediated not because I was wiser, but because I had a badge that says we try. Kaito slept for 1 hour with his head on a coil crate, woke with a start, and configured the rail lights into a pattern that anyone could use and no one could fudge without the fudge showing. Jace put his hand on the hull where the pitting had formed and told the ship a story about guiding a riverboat through a fog so thick it tasted like cloth. The ship hummed in a frequency so low it made a bolt in the deck buzz. We recorded everything. Not because transparency is a charm against harm, but because secrecy is an accelerant for those who already desire to burn. The Saint ship accepted copies of the ledgers, inscribed varieties of tick marks that we could not read yet, like the sketch of a language that only reveals itself after enough repetition. Who were you before sleeping? Celine asked, during one late pass when the rails burned cool and our breath smoked the air like winter had snuck inside. Name is a sign, it said after a pause that suggested it remembered vowels. I was a sign hung on a door that said, "Come when you are ready to be counted." Some signed me as Obsidian Anchorage. I am less an anchorage than a ledger with walls. Anchorage will do, I said. and something in the way the brass glowed told me that names, if given carefully, can be pillows for old heads. Mirror without ledger is theft. Ledger without mirror is cowardice. That line came from the ship, unbidden chime etched into the channel, as if it wanted to be written above a door. Celine wrote it with care, each letter like she was nailing it into the shed wall. The magistrate stood there reading it with a frown that slowly softened. The boy with the oven loaf tapped the words with his finger and said, "That's a good rule." "It's a precedent," I said. "One of many we'll need." We did not wait long for the next test. Fear does not like seeing its reflection, and the Tallywrights were not the only ones with knives. A group called the Concordant of the Collar had a floating shrine in the outer scrap. They wore iron circlets and spoke about obedience as if it were a balm for burns they had not suffered. They sent us a message printed on thick paper, a flourish of old ink pretending to be courtesy. "Release the saint to proper veneration," it read, "and spare your people the confusion of tools doing priest work." "Collar is a tool for hands that fear ledgers," Celine said, crushing the letter flat under her palm. "They'll try to loop a chain onto our mirror." A day later, they did more than try. Their shrine drifted in as if by accident, then plotted a line that would force our moats to choose between protecting the pirates and protecting the rails. They broadcast hymns so loud, they turned instrument noise into a choir of false positives. "Pick a priority," Jace said. "We can't keep both shields up without boiling something." Kaito's voice was tight. "Shrine has a spiker hidden under the gilding. If it discharges, the rails will trip, and then the mirror goes down. The pirates will be free to burn the ovens to prove a point. We escalate in 3 stages," I said, counting with my fingers to make it real. 1, we publish their intent as we measure it. 2, we accept depositions from their captains and from those who would be harmed. 3, if they persist, we set a second mirror, this one legal, so that their interference in safety is recorded as debt. "And tactically," Jace asked. "Tactically we steer," I said. "Gently enough to make it look like wind and hard enough to move their shrine into the quiet." "Counting on currents," he said. "I can do quiet hard. We speak law into open air, so even thieves must breathe it." Our broadcast went wide. We showed the shrine's vector intersecting with the safety corridor. We showed the coil's damage still smoking. We showed the oven's work schedules and the medtech's oxygen curves. We read the Treaty of Broken Things aloud in the West Shed, while the camera watched the faces that would pay if paper failed. The Saint ship's panel pulsed, then gentled, the brass marks deepening, as if the stylus pressed more firmly. "Ledger acknowledges intent," Anchorage said. "Mirror placement authorized. Teach me the second mirror." Celine smiled, and you could see the years fall off her like dust from a jacket. "This mirror is called an escrow," she said. "We set it so that any harm threatened creates an equal claim on the threatening party's stores. They won't feel it yet, but they'll see it written. To default is to confess." "Confession is counting aloud," the ship agreed. Jace threaded thrust through the ring, in a dance that made my stomach lurch and my faith settle. He made small burns look accidental. He gave the shrine a push with nothing but geometry. The gilded circlet drifted into a pocket of quiet, where its hymns echoed back at a volume that must have sounded to them like mockery. "They're angry," Kaito said, listening. "They'll launch the spiker." "Let them," I said. "Anchorage be ready to post their debt." The spiker fired. It was not elegant. It was a tantrum turned into a projectile. It fizzled along the rails and died with a pop like a soap bubble breaking against a nail. Our moats held. The ovens kept their heat. The medtech's patient breathed on, entrained by the pump's lullaby. "Debt posted," Anchorage said. "Balance due 126 kilowatt hours to the ovens and a public apology." The shrine sputtered, then fell silent. "You can hear a city learn to count if you listen for bread." After the second set piece, a quiet settled that wasn't truly quiet. People slept with fewer sudden wakings. A child asked her mother why the star was brown, and the mother said, Because it was meant to be a banked fire, not a blaze, and the child said, like our stove, and then went back to draw a ring and a black egg in the corner of her slate. The pirates wounded lay on gurneys with their boots off and looked smaller without their swagger. The concordant shrine drifted at a respectful distance and practiced silence like a new craft. The magistrate came to Westshed in person and stood where he had once only called. He read the charter for the Board of Broken Orbits aloud, stumbling only once on a clause about ovens, because it was written with love instead of Latin. He stamped it with his seal. Celine wrote the date, and the brown dwarf's chill halo crusted the top edge of the stamp with frost that would melt later into a ring. Marshal, he said then quieter, you have placed me in a position where I must protect a thing that frightens me. I would rather fear duty than fear what happens when I ignore it. Do not make me regret this. Magistrate, I replied. You have placed me in a position where I must trust people I have only known for a week to keep a mirror straight when my ship leaves. I would rather trust neighbors than trust guns. Do not make me regret that. We wrote the lesson on the wall where the scaffold was thinnest. By then, Anchorage had taught us enough of its numeracy to be dangerous and enough of its humility to be careful. Mid-story as we were, if this whole mess can be called a story instead of a hearing, we came to a line that needed writing clear, so even a thief could not pretend to misread it. Anchorage spoke it first, then I said it aloud. Then Celine inscribed it under the maxim about mirrors. This saintship teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. The union heads cheered with the kind of laughter that comes after a lungful of air. The mothers nodded as if this matched a recipe they already knew. The miners spit into their palms and shook on it. The magistrate underlined it twice. Remember that line I told Kaito when he sent the broadcast. If any future hand tries to loop a chain around Anchorage, start with those 12 words. We will not hold the leash for them. Count without compassion becomes a knife. Compassion without count becomes a lie. A day later, just when I thought we had earned a night of sleep, the legalists made their move. Not the magistrate, he had thrown his weight behind us so publicly that to retract it would have crushed him. No, this was a consortium of corporate counsel, from 2 systems out, men and women with sharp hair and sharper suits who arrived in a courier, painted a color that tried to be invisible by being exactly the same as the station's metal. They filed a petition of 40 pages challenging our right to set a mirror without compact adjudication. They argued that public escrows subverted the free market in energy. They used phrases like innovative misappropriation and spiritual trespass, and somehow placed those side by side without choking. We scheduled a hearing because you do not defeat law by ignoring its ugly cousins. The hearing took the better part of a day. We kept the ovens running and the oxygen curves honest while strangers spoke at length about the best way to turn dignity into a tradable commodity. I watched the faces in the crowd while their words slalomed. Some grew tighter. Some grew defiant. Some looked away. When the council attempted to introduce an injunction that would freeze all ledgers until a circuit judge 3 systems away could be convinced to look up from his luncheon, I stood and put my palm on the table. The wood remembered other palms and gave me something to borrow. You argue, I said, that counting harm is disruptive to markets. Then your market runs on harms that have never been counted. You argue that mirrors, whether rails or ledgers, will chill certain kinds of investment. Then your investments require heat drawn from lungs, ovens, and rooms where people try to sleep without dreaming of ribs collapsing. You argue that what we built is new and therefore suspect. It is older than your paper, and if it frightens you, it is because it shows the shape of your face. Anchorage chimed, just once, loud enough that one of the council dropped her stylus, and Celine smiled with all her teeth. Ledger updated, Anchorage said. Public precedent drafted. Any party that projects force into a safety zone shall accept the immediate mirror accounting of that force in energy or apology. Any party that projects law into the ledgers to deny counting shall accept the immediate mirror accounting of their denial in public notice or contempt. Teach me the penalties for contempt. Celine told it gently, like explaining the necessity of bitter herbs in a healing tea. Contempt means you speak when you must listen, or you refuse to show up to your own mirror. The penalty is simple. You don't get to talk for a while, and when you come back, your first words must be an account. Jace leaned close and whispered, "I like our teacher." "So do I said. Mirrors teach best when they show your back as well as your face. The legalists left with their suits rumpled and their injunction folded into a pocket as if it had never existed. The pirates mended. The callers practiced silence. For 40 hours, my ship slept in pieces, Jace patching the blister, Selene binding her wrist, Kaito coding redundancy into the rails, and I slept in the literal sense for 6 of those hours, and the other 34 in the way a captain sleeps. That is to say, with my boots 1 arm's length away, and my name near the surface of any dream. It was during the 3rd hour of nothing happening that Harm decided it couldn't bear being unseen. A quiet ship in the shadow of Rib 21 lit its running lights for the first time and drifted as if by accident into the space between a moat and the rail. The moat corrected the rail, hummed, and I had time to say, "That's a blind," before the ship cracked open and showed us the missile nest in its throat. "Heat up," Kaito rasped. "That's a real warhead." "The mirror won't catch all of that," Jace warned. "Not at that angle with our margin." "It will catch enough," I said. "But we'll pay a price." "Everyone in the shed," Celine called over the board voice, "calm down." We posted a mirror notice so fast my words tripped over each other, and we did it while Jace made a burn that will sit in my bones the rest of my life. He cut our drift to 0, spun the ship on a point, and offered our strongest side to the angle of approach. The missile saw a larger target us, and Anchorage saw the missile see us, and adjusted the moats into a new geometry I will dream in for years. The missile met the field and split like an egg tapping the rim of a bowl. Half the charge folded into the rail. The other half smeared across our blister in a molten kiss that turned glass opaque and pitted the metal behind it. "Starboard blister cracked," Jace said, voice thin with pain. But she held. She held. Celine's wrist brace snapped under her grip as she steadied herself, and she hissed in a way that made me look and not look. Kaito made a sound like he was swallowing fire and said, "Mirror returned," even as the pirate in sheep's hull went black and cold, with the sudden shame of a coil that had miscounted its odds. "Anchor the ledger on that," I told Anchorage. That was malice dressed as ignorance. We should not forget the tailoring. "Entry is bright," it said, and for the first time I heard a tone that suggested anger had been counted into its columns. Counting does not forgive, but it does not hate either. We took inventory. The blister was wounded, not dead. Celine's wrist was swollen to twice size and had a color like storm bruises, but she could still hold a pencil, which made her judge it survivable. Kaito's console had a scorch, where a capacitor decided it did not like living near heroism. I put all of it into the board because wounds are also ledgers, and if you don't write them down, they become stories told by people who weren't there. The magistrate arrived at my hatch with a thermos of something that steamed like soup and smelled like pepper and relief. He looked at the blister's glass, now a milky pale, and nodded. "You did not take the easy route," he said. "Easy routes don't get to write rules," I replied. "Then write this one with me," he said. He pulled a folded sheet from his jacket, handwritten ink smudged on his palm. His voice steadied as he read. "Public Doctrine on Relic Stewardship. No relic shall be bound to a will by collar or by monopoly. All relics that choose to teach shall be housed in ledgers, and their first community shall be the one to which they wake. Any doctrine that seeks to own shall be mirrored by a doctrine that seeks to count." "That's good law," Celine said softly. "That's stubborn hope," I added. Anchorage chimed again. Doctrine posted, it said. There is value in stubborn hope. Mirror theft is the most boring crime. It fails by being seen. The next days had the shape of something sustainable. The rails cooled to a maintenance hum and then warmed only when they had to. The moats drifted in rings that made children clap even if they didn't understand why. We held hearings, we baked bread, we mended blisters, and we taught Anchorage to recognize 100 little cheats that small power commits when it thinks no one is watching. It proved to be a quick study in pettiness. That is the true measure of intelligence. There were quiet vignettes I keep like pebbles in my pockets. A miner tracing the outline of the blister's crack with their gloved finger and whispering thanks to no God I know. A child giving a moat a name and scolding it when it drifted an inch out of alignment during a power fluctuation. A mother letting a loaf cool on a windowsill that was just a piece of pipe with a hole cut into it. A pirate asking the medtech if she had ever regretted learning to set broken things, and the medtech saying, every time with a smile that said she would not stop. In the middle of that quiet, a courier flickered in bearing a task I had hoped would wait. The compact wanted a report, not a summary, not a boast, but a ledger. They wanted to know if this doctrine of mirrors and ledgers could be taught to other rings, other saints, other places where counting had never been introduced politely. I stood before Anchorage's open panel brass, warm now to the touch, and told it what we had been asked. Teach it, said simply. What if they want callers first and ledgers later, I asked. They will fail, it said. Because callers forget and ledgers remember. We decided to teach by leaving something behind we could not replace. We wrote the manual in the West Shed with the same pencils that had drafted charters and recipes. We called it Counting in Broken Orbits, and it was less a manual than a song with annotations. When we finished a section on mirror notices, a child added a drawing of a moat wearing a judge's wig, and we left it, because law without humor is a brittle thing. We included Jace's thruster timings, Kaito's rail coding, Celine's fairness proofs, the mother's air budget charts, the medtech's lung curves, the miner's collapse sounds, and how to listen for them. We included the doctrine lines underlined twice and then once more. We left the manual in Anchorage's brass as much as we left it in paper. It liked to keep copies. It liked to cross-reference. It liked to make the same mark a shade darker when you told the same truth twice. Will you go with the manual? I asked Anchorage on the last night before we were scheduled to fly a loop around the far ribs to test a long-range mirror. I am an Anchorage, it said. I hold. But I can set moats on paths that others can follow and can be followed by those who have read. You speak like a court, Celine murmured, hand in her brace. I speak like a ledger, Anchorage replied. We did not expect the mirror to show us our own ship. The long-range test required us to drift beyond Rib 27 into a section where the ring's architecture had been picked clean of anything useful by people who called themselves neutral and meant by that word only that they weren't brave. The space there felt wide and cold. The brown dwarf's rust light faded into a kind of gray that made distances hard to judge. Our own running lights reflected off nothing. The silence was the kind that makes your ears ring in panic because they think they have been turned off. Strange shadow, Kaito said, pointing. A shape hung where there should not have been a shape. It had the dimension of a ship and the quiet of a tomb. Our lidar scattered off it and came back empty, which meant the skin was drinking our light. Run the primes, Celine said, voice barely a breath. We pulsed the pattern like a sailor whistling in a cave. The shape did not chime. It did not number. It did not mirror. It simply watched a great patient dark. That's not a saint ship, Jace said. That's a judge who failed the exam. Or a saint ship that learned the wrong lesson, Celine countered. Anchorage hummed through our hull, with a tone I had not heard, an old resonance from a time when even ledgers feared. Caution, it said. That one keeps collars inside its walls. I felt the weight of the manual in my hand, the weight of a doctrine not yet hardened by years of use. My blister throbbed as if it too wanted to speak. "We can't ignore it," I said. "Not with the board's charter in our pocket and the ovens depending on what wakes here next week." "Then we teach it," Celine said as if saying the obvious. "And if it refuses the lesson Jace asked, then we count failure, honestly," I replied. "And we set the mirror so everyone can see what we tried." We sang numbers into a throat that didn't want bread. The first prime set came back as static a fuzz with a sneer in it. The ratio grid became a dirty window, our triangles distorted our fairness, proof mocked by correlation that was not causation. Anchorage tightened its tone as if bracing a beam with a knee and a rope. The moats fanned out behind us like a fin. "Second mirror," Celine whispered. "Escrow, announce." Kaito's voice was steady as he read the open notice. We declared that any energy spent to disrupt counting would be accounted against the projector's stores. We declared that any refusal to accept a mirror would be posted as contempt with a penalty of public notice. We declared this in words, in numbers, in light, and with small motion so the rails could hear. The dark ship laughed. Not with sound, but with eddies in the dust that made spirals that spelled mockery in math. Then it projected something that did not register as beam or field, but as forgetting. For a heartbeat, our ledgers were blank. The manual was an empty book. The ovens were off and always had been. The medtech had never learned to set anything. The children had no names for moats. Our blister had always been uncracked. The pirates were heroes. The collars were crowns. The legalists were poets. "Anchorage," I said through teeth, "count for us." Ledger restored. Anchorage replied, and the relief hit like clean air after smoke. They tried to zero. "Zero is a lie, not a number." "Costs," I asked, because you ask, because not asking hides loss, and loss deserves a line. "Heat margin down another 6%, Kaito croaked. Anchorage took the brunt. "We're warm enough to sweat without being allowed to." "My wrist is done for the day," Celine admitted. "Pencil's a nail in the wrong board." "Then we teach with voice, not wrist," I said. "And we mirror with what rails we have." We kept teaching because we didn't know how to stop. The next set was different. We drew count lines not of primes, but of promises kept. We charted the first hearing the mirror notice the kitchen's schedule. We marked the hours of sleep the medtech had lost and promised her 2 hours back. We charted the pirate's apology, reluctant, then real. We charted the way the magistrate's frown had softened at the maxim, and then hardened again when the legalists drew their injunction. The dark ship paused, just a pause, small like the flare of a nostril before a sigh. Anchorage spoke then with a tone that deepened into our bones. "You who wear collars inside it said, not loud, not threatening, but as if it were reading the time of day. Who taught you your counting? What did you forget to count?" For a moment, the dark ship shivered, and we saw inside it not with eyes, but with the ledger's habit, to a room where someone had once taught numbers without mirrors. There was a blackboard with a neat hand and a row of students with bright faces. There was a collar in the teacher's pocket, in case the bright faces asked too many questions. The chalk made the same marks over and over until the surprise wore off. "Anchor the manual," I said. "Open it to the page where the child drew the moat in a wig." Anchorage did. The manual glowed in the brass. The child's picture looked braver than any of us. The dark ship trembled, then drew its forgetting back like a tongue burned on soup. "Third mirror," Celine said, voice hoarse. "Public notice." We posted a notice that would hang in the ring long after our blister had been replaced and our names had softened into initials. It said in plain language that any ship that tried to make zero of our ledgers would be recorded where everyone could see. It said that the Board of Broken Orbits had a doctrine that counted ovens, breath wrists, pride mirrors, and the right to stand in a shed and argue without fear of being made nothing. The dark ship did not love that. But it did not fire. It did not forget us again. It drifted back into its slot, as if discovering that its slot had been shaped by its own refusal to learn. Lesson accepted in part Anchorage said. Part is more than zero, I replied. Mirror makers must count themselves last, or the glass cracks. We eased homeward along the ring blister-throbbing rails, warm ledgers newly heavy with entries no one had known how to write a week ago. The ovens exhaled bread. The medtech slept 2 hours in a chair and woke with her head full of a dream where lungs were bellows that pumped justice. The pirates packed slower than they would have. The callers shifted in their silence. The legalists sent a single-page letter that said, "We will monitor," and for once that phrase meant what it should. They would watch us and we would watch ourselves, and both watchings would become ledgers we could hold. Anchorage dimmed its motes to match our rest. You have taught it said simple as always when the hard part was done, and you chose a path. I answered suddenly tired beyond the capacity of language to hold. Not vengeance, not empire, law. Counting is law when it is public, it said. I prefer door signs to callers. You and me both, I whispered, a little later in the soft hour, when even stations have a quiet and even children sleep. Kaito brought me a cup of something that tasted like coffee had decided to forgive me. He set it down on the console and stood there a shadow with a voice. Do you ever miss the simplicity of not knowing a thing was awake, he asked. No, I said, thinking of ovens and wrists and blisters and moats and wigs. Simplicity is nice until it kills someone. Fair, he said, and then he smiled. We're going to write a precedent that lasts longer than our bones. That's the hope, I replied and drank. We will turn our ledgers into lights others can follow. By morning the ring sounded different, like a tightened drumhead, after someone with good ears had turned the pegs. The brown dwarf's rust light slanted across rib 18 and made the frost in the shed glow with a foxfire sheen. The ovens breathed in their long rhythm. The children stitched paper motes on a string and paraded them like lanternfish. Anchorage's panel whispered the brass plates warm as skin, and the tick marks for heat budget public blinked twice before settling. We were tired in the specific way you grow tired when you've promised a city you'll keep a promise you invented yesterday. We got mail, Kaito said, holding a sealed packet with gloves because the paper was too clean to belong to anyone we trusted. The seal carried a stylized torch. The return address said, Office of Governor Reese Marek, Pythian Reach. My stomach did the small, sour twist it reserves for men who like words like order, so they don't have to say control. Read, I said. My voice had that morning rasp that makes honesty sound like a cough. Kaito broke the seal. By emergency authority under Statute 42B, the Reach declares the anchorage object a danger to intersystem navigation and claims custodial removal to the portal yard at Velith for study. Local magistrates are invited to witness. Compact officers are reminded of their obligation to ensure against hazards to licensed traffic. Invited to witness, Jace repeated deadpan. Nice way to say, hold our coats while we carry your church away. Celine flexed her splinted wrist, winced, and smoothed the letter flat against her coat, as if taming a snarl. He invokes hazard to licensed traffic. We can teach him what hazard means. We'll need to do it in public and with our mirrors set, I said. They'll bring a fleet and a legal fig leaf. The fig leaves cut most when you pretend they're pants. Teach them to name the knife before they pretend it's a spoon. We walked the docks before noon, so the vignettes would walk into us without being staged. A boy in a red cap chased a piece of foil that hung in the air with a lazy stubbornness only foil can achieve in low spin. A woman with grease on her cheek showed me a photo of her wife back on a moon where the light never changed. She said I sent her a clip of the Maxim and smiled the kind of smile you share with a stranger when a sentence has landed. A pirate no longer quite cinched a strap around a coil cradle and nodded at me like a man rehearsing gratitude. At West Shed, the magistrate stood behind a table with a crease down the middle as if it had learned to fold before anyone taught it. He had taken his robe off. Seeing a robe at a hearing that decides who owns your future makes it too easy to blame the cloth. He looked like a man instead, tired but not small. "Anchorage has a voice," he asked. "It has a chime," Celine answered, and somehow that satisfied him more than yes. We scheduled the hearing for an hour after the governor's fleet cleared the outer debris. The oven mothers insisted on setting up 2 tables, one for bread, one for paper. "If you want people to listen, feed their hands," one said, sliding a tray into heat with the confidence of someone who had never burned a loaf she didn't want to burn. The fleet announced itself in the way fleets always do when they intend to be seen before being heard. 8 ships, 2 tugs with grapples that gleamed like teeth, 1 courier wearing the governor's colors at the masthead, and a legal corvette whose dish bristled like a hedgehog. Their drive cones kept a pretense of courtesy, low burn, no wake scouring the ring. Their heat blooms, though, ran a little rich for innocence. "Running hot hides a lot," Jace muttered, fingers hovering over the thrusters like a piano player in a bar who can't afford to make noise until someone drops a coin. Kaito pinged their registry. "Their corvette's labeled Arbiter." "That's cute." "Cute is a flavor of contempt," I said. "Let's bake it into the record. Mirror their heat with your hum and let them hear themselves." The governor's face filled the shed screen. Reese Marek was handsome in the expensive way, cheekbones like a polished knife hair that belonged in a different gravity. His eyes were flat as a law book's margins. He smiled exactly 3 degrees. "Magistrate Odris," he said, as if he were greeting a concierge. "Marshal Veen, we come in civic duty. We'll take charge of the artifact and carry the risks your small community should not bear." "You carry risks," I agreed. "We'll carry the ledgers." He smiled a little larger. "Ledgers are charming local color. Public safety is not." Celine stepped forward. "Governor Marek, we're prepared to demonstrate what hazard means in this orbit and who creates it. Our mirror notices are posted. Our rails are public. Our ovens are warm. We invite your arbiter to weigh." He waved a hand. "We have our own instruments." "Then you won't mind if they count aloud," I said. "We have little time," he replied, eyes cutting to the side as if checking a schedule that had other items more important than not stealing a saintship. "Tugs will engage now. You'll be compensated for inconvenience." Jace's hand flicked. The rails sang a thin note, almost shy. Our motes took positions like chess pieces, learning why the knight doesn't move straight. Kaito threw the mirror notice out on all channels, and anchoring beams linked the corners of the governor's fleet to the corners of our case like thread through a quilting frame. Celine raised a hand. "Governor, our first witness. The oven schedule." "It has no bearing," he said. "It bears bread," she said. "Sometimes the only strategy that works is to tell a story at a volume that people cannot pretend to mishear." The oven mother with the pepper laugh walked to the table and laid down a plain chart of hours and watts, like a mother cat putting a dead mouse at your feet. She explained how much heat a loaf needs, how it hates a surge, how children cry when the smell stops halfway because the power donors found an easier line to cut. The medtech recited oxygen curves. A miner, his hands stitched from the last collapse, described ribs and screams. "There is harm here," I said, turning to the governor's screen. "Harm you can count. If your removal impairs these, you own them." "We'll compensate," he said, bored. "Compensation after harm relies on trust you haven't earned," the magistrate said, voice flat as paper. Anchorage chimed. The brass tick marks deepened. It spoke in a cadence that would have fit a courtroom 3 empires back. Ledger open. Governor Marek invoked Statute 42B. Please enumerate hours of licensed traffic delayed by this anchorage's presence in the last week. Marek blinked. He had not expected the object to ask him for numbers. "I don't carry such figures in my head," he said lightly. "You came to carry a ship, and you forgot to carry—" "The Count," Celine said, almost tender. The legal corvette pushed a file. Kaito caught the packet and held it up. The numbers were clean, a little too clean. No fractional rests, no ugly decimals. He frowned, then smiled the way he does when a puzzle shows its weak seam. They padded, he whispered. They parabolized the jam rates. They smoothed the spikiness. It looks like a lake, and this is the sea. Put it on the wall, I said. Kaito projected the curve alongside our own dirty curve. The difference was rude enough to make the shed exhale as a single animal. Arbiter, I said, looking straight into the Corvette's dish. You count for a living. Don't you get bored pretending that a crooked line is straight? The Corvette hesitated. It wasn't a saint ship. It was software with a supervisor who liked promotions. But numbers are stubborn creatures. The dish twitched. The governor's heat registers went up by 0.5 degrees. Arbiter acknowledges anomalies, a voice said. Arbiter requests revised inputs. Governor Marek's flat eyes sharpened. We do not litigate science with cooks, he snapped, losing the 3 degrees of smile. These cooks can make your numbers rise, Celine answered kindly. And we can teach your arbiter to prefer ugly truth to elegant lie. Mirror the elegance until it blinks and asks for fractions. He tried force then because men like Marek think law and force are kisses from the same mouth. The tugs burned their grapples, hot lines snaking toward our moats. Jace's fingers moved like a man playing a reel fast enough to make the dancers dizzy. The rails took the burn, eased it along, and handed it back to the tugs in the form of a lurch that made both pilots taste breakfast again. This is an unauthorized obstruction, Marek said. Stand down. Mirror placement announced an hour ago, Kaito replied, not looking up. Your burn is counted against your own coils. Check your heat margins. I don't want you to boil. Anchorage chimed lower and warmer. I can count your coils for you if you like. You threaten me with my own heat, Marek spat, and there it was, the shape of his face. I show you your temperature, I said. You can decide if sweating is preferable to learning. He cut the line. The tugs drifted back, their grapples quivering like dogs on a leash that had learned the fence was real. Anchorage turned its brass slightly, a small change that still made the light find new letters. First ledger entry for Governor Marek, attempted seizure. Hazard claimed without proportion. Ledgers padded. Remedy recommended public teaching. Escrow of energy to ovens equal to tugs waste. Apology for wasting time. Time is a resource, the magistrate said softly. We forget that because the ones with it take it from the ones without and call it efficiency. We don't need them to like us. We need them to admit the count. He didn't apologize. Men like Marek don't in front of cameras. But he accepted the escrow with a grimace, and his fleet dimmed its cones in a way that meant someone with dirty hands had whispered, It's cheaper than the fight you want. He promised a circuit judge review within 72 hours and sailed his hedgehog away with the clean curve of a man who doesn't like angles that remind him of truth. The shed exhaled, then inhaled again, because relief is a luxury we don't get without paying. The ovens finished their cycle. The medtech sent us a wave that said her patient's lungs had learned a calmer song. First escalation settled, Celine said, leaning against the table. Second will be meaner. Callers, Jace asked. Or zeros, Kaito said quietly. He had a way of seeing the shadow behind a shadow. His caution earned its wage by evening. The concordant of the caller had been quiet, which is not the same as harmless. Silence lets you carry things without rattles. They carried a polished ring the size of a freight container. It glided between ribs with a grace that felt paraded. They broadcast a hymn in a register too low for the audio systems to filter. It made the deck plates tickle your souls. The ring opened like a flower and showed teeth hidden under petals. It's a yoke injector, Celine said, voice thin. They'll try to lace Anchorage's panel and tell themselves they're vowing not binding. Anchor's brass won't take staples, Kaito said, more hopeful than certain. The carrier angled for the panel. Our motes gathered like geese spotting a fox. Anchorage's chime when it came made the shed lights flicker and the frost halo sparkle on the rafters. Concordant anchorage, said voice steady. My ledgers are public. Teach me the rule by which a caller counts better than a quorum. Silence. Then obedience avoids error. Counting avoids error, anchorage replied. Obedience avoids question. The injector pulsed. A filament leapt from its teeth and licked the panel's edge, a rope of light seeking an anchor it could claim. Our rails vibrated in sympathy, angry as plucked wire. Jace swore and bled, thrust into a tiny vector that made the filament smear across empty space like a snail drawn thin. Kaito flung a second mirror escrow for interference in a hearing across the concordant stores. Celine held up her pencil, her wrist trembling, and said, By ledger and by law, we name this a theft. It is one thing to call a theft. It is another to show it. Anchorage did the latter. The brass tick marks for concordant energy reserve dimmed as if a hand had cupped them. The tick marks for ovens brightened by the same shade. The hymn stumbled as if an organist had tripped. The concordant fired the zero trick, then perhaps out of panic, perhaps because zealotry always has that card tucked in the sleeve. For a handful of heartbeats, our ledgers went white. The manual blanked. The child's mote in a wig was only a circle without a face. The ovens read, HFY. The medtech looked at her hands and forgot how many fingers she had. Anchorage, I shouted, and the shout had fear stitched to it in a thread I hoped no one would notice. I remember it said, I remember because you told me to ledgers do not go to zero. Zero is always someone's wish. The brass flared, not bright enough to hurt, but enough to make every shadow step back. The marks returned thicker, as if drawn with a thicker chalk. The injector's teeth retracted like an animal, shown a picture of its own skeleton. Debt-posted anchorage said, Public. No collar shall be placed where ledgers have been set. Penalty apology plus public unspooling of any bound lines. The concordant drifted away, wobbling its hymn shrunk to a hum you'd ignore as a motor that needs oil. Count the people who didn't run and feed them first. We mopped up. Jace replaced a relay with hands that shook only after the screw was tight. Kaido's console held a new burn scar shaped like a clover leaf. He touched it like men touch metals they don't like admitting they earned. Celine's wrist would not fit in any brace now. She let it hang and dictated to a child who wrote very carefully in letters like a fence. I learned how much soup it takes to make an injured pride admit that thank you is a good word. The magistrate wrote a line on a piece of board torn from a crate because the paper was gone. No relic shall be subject to a ritual that denies ledgers in the name of veneration, he read, as if sanding the splinters with his tongue. Anchorage chimed like a bell heard underwater. Doctrine posted it said, remembered. We slept a few hours then, and in sleeping we missed the first flicker. The dwarf hiccuped. The ring felt it first, a tiny tug in the rails, where power stores hum even when the lights are off. The longshore's steward, she of the bad knee and good judgment, felt the twitch in her kneecap, and called it in before she called for pain cream. Brown dwarf activity uptick, Kaito said, pupils wide. Flare probability rising. If we don't guide it, it'll dump on the far ribs. That's where the linnet parks her panels. System scale mirror, Celine whispered as if she had been waiting her entire life to say that sentence, and feared offending it by saying it too loud. Can we, Jace asked. We're warm. Our margin's thin. Anchorage is awake, but if we pull too hard, we'll cook the ledger. Teach first, I said. Always teach first. Mirror a star, and you earn the right to write maxims. We broadcast another call like the night the Tallyrite's coil blew. We put it across the belt, the shed, the ovens, the panels that lined the corridor, where children ran. We said, the star is going to cough. We said, we can carry it if we all take a corner. We said, this will not be a miracle. It will be counting done with rails and prime rhythms. It will be timing and breath and trust. The civilian vignettes came without asking. A father lifted his son to see the motes forming a grid around the ring. A pirate hauled a spool with the gentleness usually saved for kittens. The medtech taped her eyelids with a strip because she refused to blink at the wrong time. The oven mother turned down her heat willingly and set loaves to rise longer, whispering, "Patience is a spice." We laid the rails along quadrants we had never powered together. Jace plotted a burn that kept us in the pocket where the star's cough would hit first. Kaito coded a sequence that would turn motes into paddles and paddles into a leaf on a stream. Celine dictated the timings like a choir leader who had learned to sing with a broken wrist. Anchorage lowered its motes into a constellation we didn't know we needed until we saw it. The dwarf coughed. Heat poured like honey in a jar, tipped too fast. The rails shuddered, sang, then settled into a tone that set my teeth on edge but made my heart beat steady. The motes caught the first spill and split it, turning a sheet into strips, strips into ribbons, ribbons into strings. The strings threaded the ring and went on outward toward the dark edges where the pirate nests used to squat. The panels on the linnet drank like a woman after 10 hours in dry air. The ovens warmed without a single scorch mark. The medtech's pumps hummed on key. "Margin," I asked, "because you count even when you want to sing." Hot Kaito said, "Down another 5. Anchorage is sweating." Old Anchorage said calmly, "I like sweating. It helps you know you're alive." We held. The flare passed like a story told under a blanket. You're sure it's going to be too loud, then it isn't, and your pulse ends up matching the whisper. When it was done, the dwarf looked exhausted. The rails hummed like a hive that had done its work, and the motes drifted back to their idle positions, with the weary elegance of dancers leaving the stage. Celine leaned against a strut and laughed a soft laugh that sounded like about 3 tears. Jace put his forehead against the blister and whispered something I did not catch, but I know a prayer when I see one. Kaito finally let go of a breath he had been cheating on time with. Public doctrine updated, Anchorage said. Mirrors may be set against stars when communities agree to be counted with them. Count victory without forgetting which bones ached during it. Costs declared. Blister's crack grew a hairline vein toward the frame. Jace's right shoulder would not lift above a certain stubborn angle for a day. Kaito's console fan failed and added a burnt lint smell to the bridge I will remember forever. Celine's wrist turned the color of old plums and did not fit in any sleeve. I found a blister on my heel, shaped like the small map of a lake that dried up when I was a girl. We logged them in the ledger under cost of lawful acts. We took pictures of the injuries because lazy future readers like to skim and then write policy as if policy is written in the same ink as skin. We wrote a thank you line for the star because it had coughed when it might have screamed. The governor sent a message 2 hours later. Men like Marek are opportunists. They smell public sentiment better than bakers smell dough. Commendable improvisation, he wrote. It proves the artifact's utility beyond your local needs. Further reason for transport to Velith, where it can be used to benefit many. You don't get to steal a stove because someone cooked for you, the oven mother said, reading over my shoulder. We'll invite him to the broader court, Celine murmured. Let him try to argue for taking ledgers away from the ledger's neighbors. We need the compact, I said, and a camera he doesn't own. Mirrors scale best when you let other eyes hold them. We sent a courier to the nearest relay with the manual 3 hours of annotated flare capture testimonies from pirates, mothers, miners, the medtech, the magistrate, and the child with the mote drawing, who insisted on describing the wig in exacting detail. We requested a special docket relic stewardship in broken orbits. We invited the governor's arbiter and the concordant. We sent the invite to a dozen small courts who had been told their jobs were to stamp, not to ask. It took 2 days for the answer to come back. And in those 2 days, we lived like any city that has had its soul tested and not found lacking. The bread tasted better for reasons no chemist could isolate. Children played mirror and rail and argued about who got to be the mote that wore the wig. Pirates helped patch the blister and did not ask for credit. The magistrate stood on the shed step and read doctrine lines aloud each morning like prayers. Anchorage dimmed its brass at night as if letting its ledgers sleep. Then the compact answered, hearing scheduled remote open record. They named a chief jurist whose smile in the pre-brief looked like it had learned to exist because it understood how much people hate smiles at hearings. They named 2 associate listeners and 1 observer from the far Hull city, where ledgers are mostly taxes and rarely promises. We dressed our side in clean coats, not because clothing matters to law, but because people matter to people. Celine wore her coat, despite the heat, like she always does. The magistrate found a tie whose knot had memory. The oven mother wore flour on purpose. Kaito combed his hair, and then messed it up again, because he thought the combed version looked like lie. Jace polished the blister until its crack showed like a scar with pride under it. The governor appeared with Marek's face polished like marble. The concordant sent a man with a soft voice and a ring on a chain. The arbiter logged on from a side window and already had a notepad full of fractions. The chief jurist nodded once and began. "This hearing seeks to resolve stewardship," she said. "Not ownership, not veneration. Stewardship. We will begin with the artifact's voice." Anchorage chimed a polite tone like a guest asking permission to tell a story at your table. "I prefer ledgers to collars," it said. "I like sweating with neighbors. Questions welcome." Celine stood. "We submit doctrine and ledgers. We have taught. We have mirrored. We have counted harm as well as heat. We have set the mirror against pirates, zealots, a governor, and a star. We request the recognition of the Board of Broken Orbits as first steward and the posting of the maxim, 'This saint ship teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars.'" Marek smiled his 3 degrees. Charming local color, he repeated as if repetition could turn truth into decoration. "We propose central stewardship for efficient allocation." "Show your allocation," I said. "Show us the ovens you plan to feed and the lungs you plan to help in numbers, not phrases." The concordant man lifted his chain. "We offer to relieve the saint of the burden of choosing. Collars simplify." "Counting simplifies better," Anchorage said. "Collars are for hands that fear seeing their palms." The jurist nodded slowly. "We have evidence of lawful mirrors set of public ledgers posted of harm turned aside by teaching. We also have evidence of attempted seizure of padded numbers of 0 tricks. We recognize that efficiency can be the most expensive lie." The arbiter cleared its synthetic throat. "Recommendation stewardship recognized locally with compact oversight. Mirror doctrine posted. Collars prohibited. Energy escrows public. Governor's petition denied without prejudice to future cooperation under ledgers." Marek started to speak. The jurist raised a hand. He closed his mouth as if a hinge had found a new pin. "We'll appeal," he said through teeth. "You can," the jurist replied. "Appeals are mirrors for judges. Count the room after a ruling and hear which hearts go quiet." He wasn't done, of course. Men like him don't stop because a camera said no. His hedgehog disappeared from the rim 2 hours after the hearing. Pirates reported chatter about a tug that had never taken a job it could count. The concordance hymn returned quieter, threadier, like a vine trying to find a seam it had missed. The dark ship that liked zeros drifted in and out of the far ribs like a cat that can't decide whose porch it owns. We found the sabotage at dawn when the rails should have been cold. Someone had spliced a bleed into quadrant 3 that would have made the next mirror wobble and then fail. It was elegant in the way a lie is elegant when it doesn't meet the eyes of the people it will hurt. Kaito found it because he knows how honest wires lie when they're afraid. "Neutral tug," Jace said, pointing. It floated lazy as a log downriver heat-low transponder set to a frequency famously non-committal. "We catch it," I asked. "We mirror it," Celine answered. "Not with rails, with ledgers, public lion." I said the idea arriving in my mouth as if my tongue had not been my own for a second. "Anchorage teach us a lean." "A lion is a mirror that attaches to a purse," Anchorage said, amused. "It announces you owe. It waits in the open where everyone can see it. It follows a ship until the owing is acknowledged." "Post it," I said. "For sabotage of rails, for risk to ovens, for insult to doctrine. Don't seize, don't choke. Simply stand in front of the tug holding a sign." Anchorage posted. The lean took form as a kind of light that clung without touching a badge. Only the guilty can see, and the innocent can read. The tug turned its cone on thought, better of it drifted, spun, emitted a message that said, "Mistake" in 3 languages and 2 silences, and sent a packet to the ovens that would have covered bread for a month. "Apology," posted Anchorage said. "Leanne released when apology is spoken aloud by the captain. We required the speaking, because shame is good medicine when not used as a cudgel. Mirror their money, and they'll hear you faster than when you mirror their morals." "Third escalation settled," Jace said half to himself. "We'll get a 4th and it'll hurt." He was right. The Concordance hymn braided with a frequency I knew too well by then, the dark ship's forgetting wave. They had learned each other's tricks. The wave hit while we were prepping the rails for another star cough. Our ledgers went dim, not blank. Just dim enough to make a careless hand mark the wrong line. Just dim enough to ruin a rhythm in a prime counting set. Celine's pencil skittered and then snapped. "Anchorage," I whispered. I can hold it said, but there was a thread of strain I had not heard before. "My motes are cool. My ledger is warm. Warm is heavier than cold." "Manual to paper," the oven mother said, already laying sheets she'd stolen from the magistrate's docket on the table. "Children, bring me charcoal." The children came with palms blackened and eyes bright. They copied the manual as it was meant to be copied, not because the previous copy was bad, but because copying is the way your hands learn what your head thinks it knows. The child who drew the wig drew it again, a little shakier, and made the wig bigger as if to shore up courage. Anchorage steadied. The dimness receded like a tide that had gotten cocky and remembered where rocks live. "Costs," I asked. "Heat margin down too," Kaito said. "We're not going to win a race later, but we'll keep a vow." Celine cradled her hand with her other hand and breathed in strategy. "Teach them audit." "Audit?" Jace asked. "Teaching someone to read a ledger so they can argue with a liar without crying," she said. "Public, simple. Let the children lead." We held an audit lesson in the shed and made it mandatory for anyone who wanted to open their mouth about doctrine. The children explained how a straight line that's too straight is a curve that's lying. The medtech showed how an oxygen graph looks when a pump fails at 2 in the morning. The oven mother drew watt hours like braids. Anchorage chimed in with a tone that made errors vibrate, and Kaito laughed at the first time a pirate elbowed a legalist in the ribs to correct a fraction. Counting is contagious when it's taught like a game and not a gun. We were ready, or ready enough, when the governor returned wearing someone else's authority. He had persuaded a circuit judge to sign a temporary order that said words like custody and discretion and in camera. He announced it with the pomp of a man who once won a ribbon for showing up. "In camera is not a phrase you get to use in our shed," the magistrate said. "Our hearings smell like bread and sweat. Cameras welcome." He had more than paper this time. He had a mercenary net, thin sharp, designed to smother motes without touching rails. He had timing that avoided the star's cough. He had a whisper for the concordant that made their hymn almost a threat. He didn't have our lien. We posted a second lien not on a tug, but on the governor's treasury. Not money exactly. We aren't that naive. Public faith. The kind that translates into votes into speaking, invites into charitable gala seating. We attached it to his ledger by citing the doctrine ratified by the compact. We wrote it in light big enough that even his smile could not cover it. Public lion anchorage intoned tones like footsteps on a wooden floor. Assessed for repeated attempts to seize ledgers and collar a mirror. Remedy apology training and audit, and a pledge to call ovens by name before calling statutes by number. He could have laughed. He didn't. His mouth did a thing I hadn't seen it lost. The 3 degrees of smile and found 3 degrees of hunger. He threw the net. The net fell like rain that had learned to be cruel. Our motes scattered on rehearsed paths. Jace rolled the ship under the net with a move that made my ribs brace for impact that didn't come. Kaito pulsed primes so fast the sound steps on the deck became a drumline. Celine held the manual against her chest like a shield that wouldn't stop metal but might stop forgetting. The net touched the rails. Rails don't like being asked to do quiet work when someone is shouting at them with wire. They hummed. The net vibrated learned prime numbers against its will and then tore itself in a pattern so clean it looked like lace. The concordant tried the 0 wave again. Children held up their charcoal. The wig grew a feather. The dark ship edged closer, maybe to watch, maybe to take the prize when both dogs were tired. Anchorage's motes flared. Not bright just enough. Enough to write one word in light everyone could read, even if they would pretend later they hadn't. Enough, it wrote. Mirror does not mean mercy, it means memory with teeth. The governor killed his cone, the concordant lowered their chain. The dark ship drifted back into its slot like it had always belonged there and was pretending to have never moved. The rails cooled. The bread rose. The medtech cried for a full minute in a corner and then laughed for 2. We wrote the precedent then because you write law while the ink of action is still wet. The magistrate, Celine, the oven mother, the medtech, the miner, Kaito Jace, the pirate. The child and I signed it. Anchorage chimed to mark it and left a new line on the brass where lines go when they want to be remembered. Public precedent on relic stewardship and mirror doctrine. Celine read aloud. A relic that wakes among a people has the right to choose to teach. Teaching shall be numbers first, mirrors, second doctrine, third. Mirrors shall be set publicly with rails and ledgers open. Collars are forbidden as instruments of stewardship. Escrows, liens, and audits are the lawful counters to force and forgetting. Bread, breath, and sleep shall be counted alongside coils and cones. Any party seeking custody must show ledgers of care before ledgers of control. The first community is the first steward with compact oversight, and the ledger of costs shall be posted including the names of those who paid in wrists, blisters, and bones. Anchorage chimed once more. Precedent posted it said, remembered, count this as a win only if you write the losses where everyone can see them. The weeks that followed were not quiet, but they were humane. The pirates rebuilt a coil with help from a child who held the wrench and asked sensible questions. The concordant hung their ring on the dock like a museum piece and let people touch it so collars could become cautionary tales. The governor's arbiter sent a clerk to learn audit from the oven mother. The clerk blushed when she got a fraction wrong and laughed when she got one right. The dark ship hovered a question mark. We sent it pages of the manual and a drawing of a wig. We received nothing and took that as a maybe. Our blister healed into a scar. Jace's shoulder clicked when he made the burn that sets a ship in the shed's shadow. Kaito's console hum settled into a note that made sleep easier. Selena took the brace off, put it on, took it off again, settled for a ribbon, and drew the Maxim freehand for a city in another orbit, who asked if we would share. We taught more than we had planned, farther than we thought our voices would carry. Anchorage set its motes along paths that ships could follow by light alone. The manual's pages photocopied themselves in jurisdictions that had thought the compact was only for men with jawlines. We learned how to answer letters from people who had ovens, but no rails, mirrors, but no ledgers, hope, but no doctrine. We wrote back in small words and big numbers. And then there was the night when everything glowed a little brighter because someone turned their cone too high and our rails caught their mistake without scolding. We stood under the panel in West Shed brass, warm like a forehead that has worked and then rested. The tick marks for precedent. Posted blinked a slow pulse as if the ledger itself had a heartbeat. A curl of vapor rose from a cooling field line. It smelled like rain on metal roofs from a childhood that had more storms than books. The sigil in rib 18 brightened for a breath and then softened as if pleased to be counted. I spoke compact and honest because endings deserve clarity that beginnings cannot afford. We came to a broken orbit with a badge, a manual we hadn't written, and a promise that could have been arrogance. We met pirates who learned apology, zealots who learned silence, a governor who learned fractions, and a star that taught us timing. We set mirrors that didn't break. We kept ledgers that didn't go to zero, and we burned our fingers without burning our neighbors. This isn't a miracle. It's a city learning to count with a saintship that refuses collars and insists on door signs. If you come here looking for power, bring a ledger. If you come here looking for mercy, bring a mirror. If you come here hungry, bring your hands and we'll teach you to bake. The ledger is open. Step up and be counted.